I'm back working on the old Washburn here, trying to get the neck to relate to the body in some deep, meaningful way. To be honest, this week has been rough. I've had a bunch of squeaky wheels and odd annoyances, which has made filming kind of difficult. That's one of the things about running a tiny repair shop. It's necessary to have multiple projects on the go, otherwise I would go broke. That doesn't always lend itself to smooth filming and editing schedules, as I have to pull everything out and set it up and then put it away again for each guitar, and the schedule gets mixed up. But, I do what I can to bring you a little taste of that sweet, sweet Luthery goodness. Here I'm doing the sandpaper pulls, a lot of them. Remember, the action on this guitar was legitimately over 1/4 of an inch, which is close to the worst I've ever had to deal with. You see I'm checking the run of the frets in relation to the top of the bridge, using the straight edge, and getting pretty depressed here because there's still 5 millimeters to go before it's where it should be. An hour or so later, I've tipped the neck enough, finally, that the line is just above the bridge, where I want it. Okay, these two parts, neck and body, have been fit together. That entails adding veneer to the sides of the dovetail tenon and shaping that through a process of incremental sanding and checking and more sanding until the entire length of the tenon is tight in the slot. There's no rocking, there's no looseness anywhere along. To be honest, I had to tip this neck an extraordinary amount. I basically ended up removing about 1/16 of an inch from the end of the heel, which is a lot. It's time-consuming work, and it also means that the difference in size between the tenon and the pocket are increased like monumentally. These two parts became laughably loose, so the shims glued to the tenon needed to be much thicker than they would on like a run-of-the-mill Martin reset. I suspect this thing had very high action to begin with from the factory. Probably no setback to the neck initially, so it was like a classical action. Greater than 1/8 of an inch, 3.2 millimeters at least. And I'm shooting for half that, which is kind of the modern standard. So what that all leaves us with is a pretty big wedge-shaped gap under the fingerboard extension. And there's no way that you could push this down and glue it to the body. Remember, this area around here is pretty much flat at this point. If it didn't break immediately, it would certainly fail very soon and would probably deform everything. So I have to make a filler wedge. But, this thing, it's tight now to the point where I could string this up with no problem. This is locked together. And even getting it apart requires some effort. So I've glued on the wedge, which in this case is a piece of something other than ebony, because I had an appropriate size and thickness, and I'm going to dye it anyway. I'll plane that off flush with the sides of the board, and I'll use a alcohol-based marker, dye marker, and there's little extra that seeps over onto the binding that scrapes away very easily with a razor blade. Then I get to glue the entire neck in, clean out the squeeze out. Okay, pearl inlay. Something you don't see me doing very much of because it doesn't seem to come up very often in repair work. As much as when you're building guitars, and I'm simply not building very many guitars these days. And to be honest, if I am building something, I tend to go with other materials for inlay rather than pearl. Not that I don't like it, it's just, I tend to use wood or something else. But it's traditional. You'll remember me trying to save the original inlays from that crispy, deteriorating fretboard. Unfortunately, though, these are quite thin. They average about 35 thousandths of an inch thick, which might work on a flat surface, but because I'm going to make this board with a slight radius to it, there's a real danger I might sand through them. And there's nothing worse than going through the whole rigmarole of doing the inlay process only to see half of it just fade into nothing at the edge when you sand through it. So I have to come up with some replicas. And I got this pearl blank, which is actually quite thick as these things go. It's about 75 thousandths, just under 2 millimeters. That's plenty of depth. The fact that we can get blanks this big and this flat is kind of miraculous, because the process is not inconsequential. There's a lot of waste in pearl production. Here's a really beautiful Paua abalone shell that was given to me by a frequent client, the left-handed guy, for those of you who keep track of such things. And you can see that there really aren't very many flat areas on a shell. And it varies in thickness. I can feel that it's quite thin in certain areas. I think this has been ground and buffed to show the colors on the exterior here. They normally don't look like this. They're just kind of drab, gray looking things. So to get blanks for inlay, it's a process of cutting this down into small pieces and then using a wet grinder to try and flatten it, which is kind of arduous. Now these were obviously cut by hand by someone working very fast. They aren't truly symmetrical in any meaningful way. This was piecework done by skilled craftspeople who probably had a quota of like 500 a day or something, so they were really motoring. I'm not sure I'm going to replicate these exactly. I think I might want something more angular, if only because those are easier to file when you haven't been doing this kind of work for years and years. I'm also missing the 12th fret marker, which was just a simple elongated diamond. It was very much a case of one of the things not being like the others, so, I can replicate that without too much problem. This blank has a defect in it, which I've marked in pencil. It's got a thin area, which I think I might try and fill with super glue if need be, if I can't fit all the pieces on this one blank. I should mention that pearl dust is not something you want to be breathing for any length of time, because it'll get into your lungs. It's got very sharp little corners, and it'll do serious damage. It's like silicosis or similar afflictions. So definitely have to put the mask on when you're working with this stuff. I think I'm in luck. I don't think I'm going to run into that void in the pearl. Sawing pearl takes a long time. It's much tougher than wood, of course, and also much harder than bone, it seems. It feels like you're cutting glass with metal tools, so you have to use a lot of patience, because it's also very friable stuff. If you knock it in the wrong way, it'll shatter. This is a jeweler's saw, outfitted with a fine blade. When you're first learning to cut pearl, it feels like you break a blade every 10 seconds. It's very frustrating. You need to learn this equilibrium between forward momentum and a really light touch, because if you try to rush it or push, ping, another blade. It's not too difficult, really. At some point you realize that turning really tight corners is possible if you keep the blade going up and down the whole time, while you turn the pearl around one center point. As long as the blade's moving, you're okay. Then I'll use a variety of small files in various shapes to clean up the cut edges and get it looking okay. In the end, I decided to copy the original shapes pretty closely, with the exception of one that seemed just a bit too ambitious for me. It was very spiky and thin, and I could tell I was going to break it, so I made a variation on one of the others. The glue cured overnight, and I can radius the fingerboard, so I'll pencil on some marks to track my progress. I'll use my 16-inch radius sanding block with some 120 grit paper, and check as I go to make sure that I'm maintaining the straightness. This takes a little while. It's kind of contemplative. To trace out these convoluted shapes, I'll actually go ahead and glue them to the board surface with just a little tiny dot of wood glue. It's much easier than trying to hold them in position. The 0.5mm pencil line on a dark surface like ebony can be a bit of a challenge to see at times, but I find that if I angle my desk lamp in just the right way, it usually shines out like a silvery beacon of hope, and I can cut to it. After I'm finished, I can just pop them free. They come loose without any damage. Here's a useful tip. If you wrap a little flag of masking tape around the actual bit, which is a titanium-coated spiral in this case, it will act as a propeller and blow the dust away from the pencil line while you're cutting. Give it a try sometime. I think you'll like it. Sure, this can be done with a CNC router. It won't have the gaps, wiggles, or undeniable charm that semi-experienced hand cutting affords, but go ahead. Set it up. Try it out. In this kind of work, speed is my friend. No, not like Lemmy. You don't want to fidget while you're doing this. But maximum RPM. It's really turning. And you just sort of float the bit along without any force. No pressure against the wood. You just kind of like drift it. And it's pretty controllable. I've done this job enough, this whole replacing the inlay thing, that I feel some slight compassion for a future repair person who in 90 years might be called upon to pull these things out and do this whole job again. Let's hope that doesn't happen. So I kind of do this in a two-part procedure. I use regular yellow woodworking glue on the bottom, and rather than epoxy. And then I'll just fill the little gaps around the side with some dust, ebony dust, and then wick a little thin super glue in there, which will sand up very nicely and look good, but these will come out slightly more easily than if I had just epoxied the whole thing. Yeah, I know it looks a little overly messy at this point. I'm not being very careful. But you have to remember the board has only been sanded to 150 grit at this point. The whole thing needs to be sanded more, and this will all clean up just fine. Sanding, sanding, etc. I'll clean off the dust with some naphtha, put just a tiny little bit of oil on it. And that's some pearl inlay. Can you see the one little change I made to the layout? That's right. I moved the fret marker from the 10th fret to the 9th fret, so it aligns with modern sensibilities and lines up with the side dot marker. Previously it was at the 10th fret. Here's one of the simplest and most frequent actual repair jobs that pops up. I think it was the first job I ever did for money, actually. The patient today is a Gretsch Electromatic, which is a model I'm kind of fond of. It's not the most expensive guitar, but I really like them. The problem is, the upper strap button is not really screwed in. It's kind of wedged in, and wedged in place with some tape around the threads. Which, why is this an issue? Well, it's not if you maintain a grip on the instrument at all times. However, if you're like another customer of mine who was playing a Kiss tribute, and they got to the point of, I want to rock and roll all night, when the band cuts out and everyone raises their hands in the air to clap and keep that party going, well, if your strap button is not really attached, that's the point where the headstock of your Explorer hits the stage and the party kind of breaks up. So it's good if this is more firmly attached to the instrument. So I'm going to remove this Teflon tape. It did the job. No leaks occurred. Gretsch strap buttons, these interesting knurled guys, may be a little bit more difficult to install than some if you don't have specialized equipment. But in this case, it's hard to see how this happened, unless the hole was drilled overly large to begin with. There is an impulse held by many to just shove a toothpick in there and break it off and then screw this right back in. Which, depends on the toothpick, I guess, but it's not the best way to do it because the problem could recur if this gets twisted back and forth. It's better to plug this hole and re-drill it. I'm going to re-drill the hole so that it's an accurate size and matches the dowel I have. Here's a tip. If you're making your own dowel, it can be advantageous to put a couple of little score marks down the sides. This gives the glue someplace to go, and in this case where the dowel is a little bit snug, it also allows it to compress and bounce back when the glue hits it, so that this is going to be really snug. You'll note that commercially made dowels for assembling furniture usually have grooves in them for this reason. Okay, this is a piece of maple doweling, which will go in there with some glue. Given the choice between putting the glue on the dowel or in the hole, do the hole, because as the dowel's inserted, it will pick up glue all around its circumference and drag it right down into the hole. if you just put it on the dowel itself in a tight fitting hole, a lot of it will get basically scraped off by the top edge. So that will go in there. This saw has no set in its teeth. They don't stick out beyond its width, so it's less likely to scratch the finish. I'm just using a very small portion of the edge. I'll let that dry a little bit, and then I can clean that up with a chisel. We'll re-drill it. So we have to re-drill the pilot hole. Don't want to make it too big, so I'll measure the root diameter of the screw threads, which is the sort of the bottom portion of the web in between the spiky parts, and come up with somewhere around 110 thousandths. So that's about what I'll drill. The outside diameter is closer to 140 thousandths. So, you know, that's not a whole lot of difference, to be honest, but it makes all the difference. I'm going to eyeball the center and use this awl to give myself a starting point. And 110 thousandths is about 7/64ths of an inch, which is about 2.7-ish millimeters. Use whichever increments you like. The guitar doesn't know whether you're addressing it in metric or imperial, or some odd combination of the two. Do what makes you happy. Here's the tricky thing. This dowel is end grain that we're screwing into, which is not the strongest thing to screw into, to be honest. So what I'm going to do is actually tap the threads into it using the strap button itself. It's not acting like an official tap, I know that. It doesn't have a clearance cutter, but it is going to chase some threads into it. So I'm going to go all the way in there with this thing, go in a little bit, come out a little bit, go in a little bit, and then remove the entire thing, and I'm going to soak that end grain with some thin super glue and let it dry before I put this back in. Just a little dabble do. Don't get this stuff all over the finish, that would make you look like a fool. So we'll let that cure. We don't actually glue the screw into the guitar, that would be foolish as well. Okay, so that goes in now with just the right kind of tension.